Imagine you were standing in a courtroom. A sentence is being read aloud. The words are in a language you do not speak, yet they determine something about your life, your land, your freedom, your future. You can see the judge speaking. You can see others nod in agreement, but you understand nothing. This was not unusual. For much of history, systems of law, religion, and administration operated in languages that large portions of the population did not fully understand. This is not a story about illiteracy. It is a story about access. Writing did not begin as a universal tool. It began as a specialized one. The earliest confirmed writing system, Sumerian cuneiform, developed around 3200 BCE in the city of Uruk, emerged within administrative contexts. Grain tallies, labor records, temple inventories. The first written marks were not literature. They were systems of accounting, and they were produced by trained specialists. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribes were educated in institutions known as tablet houses, eduba, where students spent years learning thousands of signs and conventions. Access to this training was limited. Writing was not simply learned, it was entered. Even as cuneiform evolved to include phonetic elements, it remained far removed from everyday speech. It required formal training to interpret. In Egypt, writing carried a similar weight. Hieroglyphs, sacred carvings, were known as Medu Necher, the words of the gods. Writing was tied to religious and administrative authority. Those trained in it occupied a distinct social position. Only a small percentage of the population could read or write. This was not seen as a problem. It was a feature. So the question is not why so few people could read, but why access to writing was never expected to be universal. Complexity does not always prevent understanding. It often limits participation. In ancient Egypt, multiple writing systems existed side by side. Hieroglyphs for monuments, hieratic for administration, demotic for everyday use. Each required different training. Each served a different role. To fully navigate the system, you needed access to all of them. In Mesopotamia, Sumerian continued as a language of scholarship and law long before it was no longer spoken. It was learned not because people used it, but because authority was written in it. This created a divide between spoken language and institutional language. A similar structure appeared in China. Classical Chinese functioned for centuries as the language of governance and scholarship. It differed significantly from everyday speech. In theory, anyone could enter the imperial system. In practice, mastering the language required years of study, often accessible only to those with resources. Across these societies, the pattern is consistent. Language did not simply communicate meaning, it organized access to it. When understanding requires specialized training, participation becomes selective. Understanding a word is not the same as understanding its implications. In early legal systems, interpretation mattered as much as the text itself. In Rome, the 12 tables made laws visible, but applying them remained complex. The pontificates, an elite priestly group, controlled legal procedures, calendars, and the exact formulas required to act. Knowing the law did not mean you could use it. Interpretation required guidance. The same pattern appears in religion. In Jewish scholarship, written texts exist alongside traditions of interpretation. In medieval Christianity, scripture was preserved in Latin, while clergy provided authoritative explanation. These systems did not always block access to text, but they concentrated authority over meaning, and that distinction is critical. Control over interpretation does not restrict what is written. It shapes what can be understood. In 813, a council in the Frankish world instructed priests to deliver sermons in local languages so people could understand them. That instruction reveals what came before. For centuries, Latin dominated law, theology, and administration in Western Europe. It was precise, stable, widely used among elites, but it was not the language most people spoke. As spoken Latin evolved into regional languages, the written form remained fixed, and so a divide emerged. Those who knew Latin could participate. Those who did not depended on those who did. A similar pattern appeared in England after the Norman conquest, where French became the language of the courts. Language in these contexts did more than communicate. It signaled position. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu described this as linguistic capital. Certain forms of language carry value beyond their meaning. To speak in an institutional form is to be seen as credible. To speak outside it is often to be overlooked. Language does not only express status, it helps assign it. By the modern era, literacy expanded. Education spread. Language became more standardized, but access did not become equal. Legal systems developed specialized vocabularies. Medical and technical language prioritized precision over accessibility. These systems serve real purposes, but they also create distance. You can read a legal document and still not understand its implications. You can access a scientific paper and still not grasp its meaning. Shared language does not guarantee shared understanding. Philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein suggested that the limits of language shape the limits of what can be expressed. In practice, this means participation depends not only on literacy, but on fluency within specific systems. And when language becomes specialized, access to meaning becomes uneven again. For centuries, language existed behind layers of access, not always hidden, not always restricted by force, but structured. Structured in ways that required time, training, and proximity to power. Not because people were incapable of understanding, but because understanding was never meant to be evenly distributed. When meaning is concentrated, interpretation becomes authority. And when interpretation becomes authority, agreement does not require force, it requires trust. Trust in those who speak with recognized clarity. Trust in those who define what words mean. This pattern is not new. In the earliest writing systems, in places like ancient Sumer, knowledge was already being organized this way. Not simply recorded, but positioned, placed within systems that determined who could read, who could interpret, and who would be understood. Because when the structure of knowledge makes outcomes feel predictable, obedience begins to feel reasonable. And when interpretation carries the weight of certainty, it no longer appears as authority, it appears as truth. Human societies were never defined only by what they knew, but by what they were allowed to know and who was allowed to explain it. That's why across civilizations, it often feels like two roles were always present: those who lived within the system and those who defined it. There was always a language for everyone, and another layer understood fully by only a few. And in the space between those two, decisions were made. Not by everyone, but by those who decide.